Our kids are being, handed cell phones. We're using devices more and more. Surely, I assumed they did a study and are doing ongoing research to determine if this is safe and they know what a safe level is. And I assumed all those things. But what I found out was that, in fact, it was never done. In the United States, we never determined safety standards. The EPA was defunded from doing that in 1996. So here we are 2 decades later, and now we're adding in 5G, which is going to be using all the current frequencies and technologies that we have now, adding in higher frequencies, millimeter waves, especially in the cities. At least that's what the companies are saying that they're going to be using. And millimeter waves are used as a crowd control weapon because at very high levels, they make your skin feel like burning. And they uniquely are absorbed into the skin. And many scientists are saying there needs to be a moratorium on 5G. In fact, over 250 scientists are calling for a moratorium on this rollout because of the increase in cancer and because we really don't have adequate safety limits.
Welcome to the Wise Traditions Podcast, sponsored by the Weston A. Price Foundation for wise traditions in food, farming, and the healing arts. We're your source for scientific knowledge and traditional wisdom to help you achieve optimal health.
Hey everybody, I'm Hilda Labrada-Gore and this is episode 171. Our guest today is Theodora Scarato. Theodora is the Executive Director of the Environmental Health Trust. EHT is one of the leading environmental health organizations working on 5G, small cells, and cell phone radiation. Theodora coordinates international scientific programs with scientists and research institutions all around the world on this issue of 5G cell phones and health. She is an expert who lectures everywhere on this topic. Today, we begin the conversation with Theodora at square one. What is 5G exactly? Who's promoting it? Is it really going to give us faster internet? Is that what we want? What is its impact on the environment and on our health? And how do we best protect ourselves from the radiation emitted from these small cell towers? And how do we slow the unfettered rollout of 5G where we live? So many questions. We try to get it all into this episode today in a timely conversation on this critical topic. Before we begin, we want to give a quick shout out to our sponsors who help make this show possible. The Wise Traditions Podcast is brought to you in part by Serenity Farm Bread, long fermentation sourdough bread and cookies, baked in our traditional wood-fired brick oven and shipped to your door. Order today by calling 870-447-2211. For email orders and to learn more about us, go to serenityfarmbread.com. Oh, and get 10% off when you mention the Wise Traditions Podcast on your phone order or in the subject line of your new order email, now through April 15th. Vintage Tradition. Green Pasture and Vintage Tradition have teamed up to create the first all-animal oil skincare and muscle and joint care products. They're the closest thing to your skin's own natural oils. Go to vintagetradition.com to check them out. And Ancestral Supplements, putting back in what the modern world has left out. New Zealand-sourced liver, organ meats, and bone marrow in convenient gelatin capsules. I know my own family needs more organ meats in our diet, so we got some for ourselves. Order yours today at ancestralsupplements.com. This is Holistic Hilda, and you're listening to Wise Traditions. Welcome to Wise Traditions, Theodora.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
This is such a critical topic, this topic of 5G, because I understand there's going to be this big rollout in major cities in the U.S. Is that right?
Yes, it is. The Federal Communications Commission and internet companies are trying to roll out 5G. They already have test cities in place. It's going to mean millions of new mini cell towers in neighborhoods.
Well, how did you personally get passionate and so involved in this area?
Well, when I first heard about 5G, I was like, well, what is 5G? And what I learned is that it's the fifth generation technology. And what it would mean for me as a mother, as someone who has a home, that it would be a tower, a new pole built in front of my house or added on to the utility pole, like when you look out your window, and it would have cellular antennas at the top. And at the bottom would be a utility meter that would be a smart meter, meaning it would have radiation coming out of it, as well as a big, up to 20 cubic feet square electronics box in the front yard near where the sidewalk was. And what concerned me most as a parent and having kids who now they're older now, but would certainly climb trees and play in the front yard, is that it would be a cell tower, really. It's a shorter tower with antennas. And I began to think about that. And in looking at the research, which I've been working on for many years, it's not just not safe, but it's more than that. There are so many studies showing effects. So I knew I had to get involved.
Well, we're going to put a link in our show notes to the very studies you're talking about because we want people to know specifically what they are showing. But let's go back for a second before we talk about the risks and the harm involved in 5G. Mm-hmm. Can you get a little more specific about what these little cell towers are? Why do they need to put so many around? What's the strategy with this 5G?
This is like a densification of meaning more and more towers in our neighborhoods, not just in the commercial areas where we go shopping or where the industrial buildings are. What companies are saying is that in order to connect, so like 5G is about connecting your cell phone to your washing machine, to all these wireless things that you have in your house. They're all going to be connected. But then there are these self-driving cars that will have a lot of sensors and all be connecting in real time. There are all kinds of machine-to-machine connections, phone to the cloud connections that companies are wanting to sell us more stuff via. That's how I see all of this 5G coming together. So the strategy to make that work is that there have to be all of these mini cell towers in neighborhoods, up to 2 to 10, every 2 to 10 houses is what I've heard, to make this work. That's what companies are saying, even though at the same time they say that they have 5G technology that can travel much further. So some of what we're hearing doesn't make sense.
Oh, so it's almost like they're saying we need these little cell towers very close together. And then they're also saying maybe we don't.
Well, yeah, that's what they're saying. They're saying both things.
I guess there's confusion too, because you're saying these companies want to push it on us, but I've heard that it's consumer demand for faster internet and better connections.
Yes, that's what they're saying, but it gets a little, some of this also doesn't all add up, because within your home, you have your own connections in the home that you can set up through your modem. What's not being said is that wired service is faster, safer, and more secure, especially related to hacking. And hacking is a whole other issue related to 5G that could be a whole other podcast. But you can get super fast service in your home with wires. What we recommend is that using the safer and more secure wired communications as much as possible is the way to go.
Because it's faster, it's more secure, and there's less exposure to the radiation. And is that the crux of the problem with 5G, Theodora, that we're getting exposed to more radiation?
Well, I think there are a lot of problems. I think the radiation is a number one issue for many people, certainly for myself. But there's also issues of environmental impacts from all of the energy use that this explosion of interconnected technology is going to use. And that's another factor, as well as the privacy issues. Because if everything's connecting with everything else, you can easily hack into it. And also, all of your information, all that data is being utilized by companies who are creating a picture of you as a consumer. And this is a whole other issue, is the privacy issue as well.
So these companies are pushing for it, and that's great. I mean, that's their prerogative. But are there studies being done? I mean, you mentioned some at the top, but shouldn't this be carefully thought through and the health and energy implications before we proceed with the installation of 5G?
Well, actually, senators have been calling on the FCC for proof of safety because a couple months ago it was stated that there was proof of safety when we know there is not. And in fact, what's happened in our government is that there really isn't a health and safety agency whose job it is to systematically review the science and to determine, looking at the body of science we have now about this radiation and its effects, what will it mean for human health? And there hasn't been any systematic review. And I know I had assumed that. I mean, our kids are being, handed cell phones. We're using devices more and more. Surely, I assumed they did a study and are doing ongoing research to determine if this is safe and they know what a safe level is. And I assumed all those things. But what I found out was that, in fact, it was never done. In the United States, we never determined safety standards. The EPA was defunded from doing that in 1996. So here we are 2 decades later, and now we're adding in 5G, which is going to be using all the current frequencies and technologies that we have now, but adding in higher frequencies, millimeter waves, especially in the cities. At least that's what the companies are saying that they're going to be using. And millimeter waves are used as a crowd control weapon because at very high levels, they make your skin feel like burning. And they uniquely are absorbed into the skin. And many scientists are, of course, now raising, saying there needs to be a moratorium on 5G. In fact, over 250 scientists are calling for a moratorium on this rollout because of the increase in cancer and because we really don't have adequate safety limits, certainly not in the United States or anywhere in the world, actually. Hard to believe.
It is hard to believe. I'm trying to pick my jaw up off the floor. And I'm also thinking about a scene I saw in the movie Generation Zapped about children having, this is even before 5G, I think, but they were just talking about children having their schools too close to cell towers and the impact that was having on their concentration and their focus and their health, and even the impact of just having wireless, the things kids have in their classrooms now, the laptops and the little, devices, the various iPads and whatnot. And they showed how it really is affecting them on a cellular level.
Yeah, I mean, at the cellular level, the body, our cells are being affected by these frequencies. And, there was a study that just came out from Switzerland where they looked at teenagers for 1 year who used cell phones for 1 year. And they found after 1 year damage to the memory on those children or teenagers who held it to one side of the head. And you think about what will the impact be? And by the way, there are numerous studies on impacts to the brain that have looked at brain cells and various parts of development. But what will the impact be to a lifetime of this exposure to our children whose brains are still developing?
Yeah, it's alarming and very concerning. So what is the likelihood that the industry or that our government officials will listen to those 250 scientists that you mentioned who are trying to wave a flag of warning for us all?
Well, I think this is a case of many hands make light work. I don't believe that these scientists are going to be listened to without, at every level of government, people talking to their elected officials to say, you need to look at this, and the issue is urgent. This is something we need to look at now, not wait anymore. We had the National Toxicology Program study results were released earlier this year, and this was a 2-decade study that was first initiated in 1999 or nominated. The FDA nominated this study in 1999 because, as the FDA said, we don't really know what the long-term effect of this radiation exposure will be. And animal studies need to be done to understand this because, of course, you wouldn't want to test humans. You can't expose humans in research studies to this, which is, by the way, what we're doing, right? We're in a large experiment.
Absolutely.
Of which we know what the outcome may be at several levels. So what they found with this was a $30 million study. And Dr. Ronald Melnick, you can go online and read his writings and his recent op-ed in The Hill. As he says, he led the design of the study. He said it was designed to look at the assumptions that underline our current radiation limits, our FCC limits, the radio frequency radiation limits in the United States. And he says it failed the test because the animals had clear evidence. The conclusion is clear evidence of cancer for the schwannomas of the hearts in the male rats. And there was also some evidence of brain gliomas of the brain. And of course, there was also DNA damage, as well as the damage to the ventricle of the heart in both the male and female animals. And if this radiation was safe, that simply shouldn't have happened because this was so carefully exposed. The animals they knew what the levels of radiation were. So we know, and that sort of has capped off the research in the sense that is strong animal evidence that we now have that is the final results.
What should we do to protect ourselves personally? And then how can we advocate for ourselves on a different level?
Okay, well, let me tell you a quick story. So here I'm in Maryland, and in Montgomery County, and actually as well in Tacoma Park, but I'll talk about Montgomery County real quickly. They were about to put forward a zoning ordinance, which basically would have unleashed the floodgates on putting up these small cells, these antennas in our front yards. And when people organized and advocated and talked to their elected officials and started, coming to meetings, testifying, and really looking at this issue, that zoning change did not pass. As well in Tacoma Park, Maryland, where they were about to pass an ordinance related to putting these up. Community members got together and said, hey, we need to look at this. Let's look at what other cities are doing, and found that there are cities like in Burlington, Massachusetts, Petaluma, California. We actually have a webpage where we list all of these ordinances, which are far more protective. Some are banning wireless facilities in neighborhood areas, ensuring that there's public notice, asking for radiation measurements, and also putting charges on the different ways, like having to get the permit that you would have to charge money based on the application fees and doing radiation measuring and things. But all of these things to control this deployment, and some to halt it, because cities can use their authority to make changes, but the people really need to get organized and educated and educate city officials. This is happening nationwide where people are organizing on this.
Yes, you told me the story before we started rolling about those firefighters in California. Can you tell us about what kind of exemption they got on their firehouse?
Yeah, so this is a whole other level. So at every level, the FCC and companies are trying to put up these small cells as easily as possible without, people stopping them by saying, I don't want one in my neighborhood. And one of the things that's happening is there are these state streamlining bills. I think there are about 21 passed now, where the state passed a bill that takes away, strips a lot of the city's authority to regulate. So a city could say, well, I don't want them here, or I want them to be, a couple 100 feet from homes. But these streamlining bills just remove that, so that companies don't have to deal with a city that doesn't want a small cell right in their front yards of people. So there was a bill, SB 649, in California that was moving forward, and the firefighters have long fought to have these not on their stations because of research that was done years ago, actually, that showed neurological impacts to firefighters. And you can go online and watch them testifying on this. They lobbied hard not to have these on their stations and were able to get themselves carved out of SB 649.
Did they cite health reasons? Was that the reason they were able to get the exemption, or?
Well, they've been talking about health for a long time in California. So health is something that they've raised. There's actually a CBS piece, which I hope you'll provide the link to, where they have interviews with firefighters and also to the researcher who did the research that showed the neurological impacts. So they are talking about health. There's testimony where one firefighter compares this issue to cigarettes and says, look, this is not safe for us. And remember when we thought cigarettes were safe? Yeah.
There was a time when people thought that. So, well, good for them. So this gives us hope. So talk to us again about what we might be able to do where we are on a personal level. I think you already mentioned about maybe wiring using landlines for maybe our phones and our computers, but what else can we do personally? And then what can we do to advocate for what we want? To whom do we run to get our voices heard?
Okay, yeah, this is a lot. So I'll start with at the personal level, using wires is safe. So as much as you can use wired technology, if you have long voice calls making them on a wired phone. And if you don't have your copper line, you can get a voice over IP or a phone through your internet provider, certainly hopefully for work and for if you have an office and for your home, and decreasing exposure to your cell phone, keeping it away from your head, using it on speaker. We have a list of ways to reduce exposure on Environmental Health Trust at ehtrust.org. Thinking about wired accessories at home, not just your computer, which can be wired with an Ethernet, but also your mouse, your keyboard, speakers, all of these things, choosing wires. And in terms of 5G, advocating first at your very local level, educating, talking to your neighbors, getting together. We had a teach-in here in Tacoma Park, a meeting where it was 6 people presented on the health issue, on the policy issue, what the city can do, what's happening in other cities. Have meetings educating the community and start meeting with your local officials about an ordinance that they can pass to control the unfettered rollout, which is what's happening. And then there needs to be action at the state level to halt streamlining bills, which are stripping away local authority. And at the federal level, there are bills moving forward which are going to be nationwide, pulling out any authority of local governments not any, but a lot of the authority of local governments to protect their communities.
Coming up, Theodora explains what's happening on a federal level when it comes to 5G, and she also goes into the first small steps she took to lower her family's radiation exposure in their home.
You're listening to the Wise Traditions Podcast, sponsored by the Weston A. Price Foundation. We pause now to recognize our sponsors.
Listeners like you, Susie Northstar had this to say on iTunes: I'm hooked. I have learned so much listening to this podcast. It is a must listen to. Adding to my review, I have to say I loved your episode en español. Le envié este a mi madre para escuchar. Finalmente, le convenció para unirse a WAPF. Por favor, haz otro episodio en español. Muchas gracias. Basically, Susie was saying she loves this show in English and she wants another episode in Spanish. You've got it, Susie. It so happens we are launching our Spanish version of this podcast this very week. Look for Tradiciones Sabias on iTunes and on our website. The episodes will be released each week for a season. Please share them with everyone you know who speaks Spanish. And gracias. And grass-fed beef brain by Ancestral Supplements. Ancestral Supplements offer New Zealand-sourced nose-to-tail organ meats, bone marrow, and brain in simple, convenient gelatin capsules. Traditional peoples and early ancestral healers believed that eating the organs from a healthy animal would strengthen and support the health of the corresponding organ of the individual. For instance, the traditional way of treating a person with a weak heart was to feed the person the heart of a healthy animal. Similarly, brain was frequently consumed and believed to support brain, memory, and mood health. Included in beef brain are neurotrophic factors that support the survival of existing neurons and encourage the growth of new neurons, as well as sphingomyelin, which plays a central role in the myelin sheath and cell signaling. Visit ancestralsupplements.com to see what they can do for you. Ancestral Supplements, putting back in what the modern world has left out. This is Holistic Hilda, and you're listening to Wise Traditions. So talk to us about the federal level a little bit more. What's happening on that level, Theodora?
Regulations are moving forward with the FCC and also in Congress to strip the rights of state and local governments to regulate or to have authority, to have a say as to where these small cells are going to be placed. And it's really important to contact your federal elected officials and ask them to address this immediately by not supporting bills that are going to allow this rollout, sending them the International Scientific Appeal and asking that they address this issue. The second piece is that at the federal level, our health and safety agencies are not doing their job. The FDA should be doing, and I hope asking the EPA to do a systematic review of the science and developing adequate safety limits, which we do not have and never developed. So our elected officials should be asking the EPA and the FCC to ensure that our regulations are adequate to protect human health by doing a scientific review of the literature.
Now, didn't you say earlier when you and I were speaking offline that there is actually some kind of act that limits our referring to health concerns when we're talking about this new technology?
Yeah, I couldn't believe when I was told, when I was advocating around cell towers at schools, that you're not allowed to make a decision about cell tower placement, this is what I was told, based on health. And as I started to look into that, I found that the Telecommunications Act of 1996, which was the most heavily lobbied bill, and I believe still may be if you look at the money, has a section in it, Section 704, that says as long as the radiation output does not exceed FCC limits, you can't advocate based on environmental concerns. And this has been interpreted, and many would say it is an overreach of the statute, to mean, and your officials are going to be told this, that they can't talk about health because it would violate that act. Now, how is it that we have a law that is being interpreted that we can't advocate for our family's health when we're talking about a cell tower in front of your home and there are numerous studies that have shown harmful effects?
That's absurd and unthinkable, really.
Yes, and cities can be sued.
If you bring up health?
If the policymakers
Oh, I see.
talk about that they're doing this because of health concerns. But again, this is an overreach, and many legal experts are saying that actually this is an overreach of the statute. But I know that at our meetings, the officials will say, and we can't talk about health concerns because of the Telecom Act. Now, the people can. The people can go and testify and talk about it.
I see, but the officials, they feel like their hands are tied. And it may be like you said, an overreaching understanding of that particular provision. But be that as it may, that shouldn't silence our own voices. Now, Theodora, I wanted to ask you, what's happening in other countries when it comes to 5G and wireless cell towers?
Yeah, it's really interesting. So first, in the United States, we have among the highest allowable radiation limits for cell tower radiation. So we allow a lot more than several other countries like Italy, China, Russia, Switzerland, and Poland, actually. So what's happening is in those countries that have more protective rules around cell tower radiation and cellular antenna radiation, the industry is stating that they can't roll out 5G because they need to change the government's limits in order to fully deploy 5G. And they are putting millions of dollars into advertising and lobbying to get these countries to change their laws. And many people are organizing in other countries. I just read a letter coming out of Greece. I know in Poland and in Switzerland where doctors are stating, well, we don't think this is a good idea because of what we know about the science now. And certainly they are saying there is absolutely no proof of safety for this radiation. And there haven't been, knowing what we know about current wireless technology, in that it is not safe. And scientists are saying that it is a human carcinogen. And also there are all of these other effects, increasing inflammation in the body, everything from headaches, impacts to the reproductive system. So knowing that, we should not be moving forward with a new technology that's going to exponentially, it's going to increase the radiation. So much so that you have to change other countries' limits. Does that make sense?
No, and I'm shaking my head, but I'm also thinking about, even if we understand this intellectually, though, Theodora, I'm thinking about how we might even find resistance within ourselves to actually act on what we've heard. Do you know what I mean? There's kind of an emotional component here. Can you address that?
Yeah, I found it. I loved my cell phone. When I first learned about this issue, I had Wi-Fi in my house. I absolutely was loving texting and sending pictures and all of these things. And it was very hard for me to believe. And I think when I talk to other people, like we love this technology we've become so dependent on, and we use both at work with our, for entertainment, socially, and we don't want to believe that it could be harmful. Oh my goodness, or that we may have exposed our children to something that could harm them. And although it was unknowing, I mean, I know I used to have my little kids using the cell phone, and I think that's really hard to swallow sometimes, all the time, that we personally need to change. It's just sort of it's like, I think it's really hard to think about this.
It is hard. And I think I've heard this phrase, know better, do better. Like, in other words, we didn't know at first, right? But now that we're aware, we can make different choices. And if it's difficult to imagine a whole overhaul where suddenly your computer's got Ethernet in your home and you've only using the landline, if you can't imagine all that, make some small adjustments. I would think that's how I would try to proceed, because otherwise it can be quite overwhelming.
Yes. And I would say it was like I made a series of small steps that all sort of made sense. And each time I did the next one, I thought, oh, that was doable. That I can do that. First it was like, okay, so I have to change my relationship with my cell phone. This was the hardest thing, because it used to be that if I couldn't find my phone, oh my goodness, like I would be stressed out. My whole life ended. What could I do? I had no phone, is how I used to feel. Now my phone is generally off, but that took time. I even plugging in the computer, it turned out all I had to do was get an adapter. And once I got the adapter, just plug it in. I mean, I'm sitting at the same desk all the time, so it wasn't that hard. So I think with the small changes that take time that people can do, you can actually address a significant amount of your personal exposures that are of devices that are close to your body that way. And I gotta say, seeing what's happening in communities, people really, really can make a difference in getting their cities to take a more protective stance. I've seen it time and time again here in Tacoma Park. It was like in 2 weeks, there was a turnaround where the council, now that they had the information, now that they saw what other cities were doing, were sort of looking at what can they pull that makes sense to have authority to decide what they want in their neighborhood. I mean, this is about people in communities being able to say what they want in their street and how they want to use technology. And it just makes sense, actually, that we should be a part of the process rather than companies telling us what to do or how to do it.
Rather than being those passive guinea pigs as part of a huge worldwide experiment.
Yeah, it's involuntary exposure. I mean, people really don't know. And once people start to find out and say, you mean there's going to be a pole in my front yard? Or you mean that my little street light, because you know what they're doing is they're taking the street lights and they're making them go up like 8 feet, putting antennas on them. Like, well, I don't want that. Look, I don't need that. I already have the internet in my home that serves my needs. What would that be for in a neighborhood? And once people start to connect the dots, they say, look, let's look at this. Let's re-look at this and do what makes sense and what is safe for our children and their future. Because it doesn't make sense to roll something out. You know, even if you don't think, you say, well, I don't know if it's proven or not. And I'm not a scientist, so I can't understand the science, but we all know enough to know that if there is a chicken salad in your refrigerator and it's been a couple days, you probably shouldn't feed it to your kids. We all take the precautionary approach. A lot of people can agree with that for sure. In this case, we have so much science that it's actually shocking how many studies there are that have found harmful effects. And I think the situation is urgent.
Theodora, we're going to wrap up. And instead of asking my usual question, I want to ask you, what is the impact, or what have they seen in terms of the impact of these waves on nature?
There is a substantial body of research. So, for example, our pollinators. Research shows that with these frequencies, with wireless frequencies, there are biochemical changes in bees which are harmful, and it stresses out bees. On the Environmental Health Trust website, we have a number of these studies as well as reviews. In terms of birds, there are impacts to their navigation, impacts to their reproduction, actually. And trees is a concern that many people are raising as well, because remember, if you have a small cell in front of your house, those antennas could be near trees, in many cases, right near the tree's leaves. And there's a lot of research showing damage to plants and to trees. And we have an entire page actually on these research studies.
Wow. So birds, bees, and trees. Just think, if it's impacting the birds, bees, and trees, it's very likely that it's impacting us as well. So I think this is a powerful note to end on, and hopefully we'll all take to heart your advice about how to act on this information on a personal and a global level. So thank you so much for your time today, Theodora. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much.
Our guest today was Theodora Scarato. For more on 5G, go to ehtrust.org. And I'm Holistic Hilda, the host and producer of the show, and a podcast consultant. You can find me at holistichilda.com. For the complete show notes with links and resources that we mentioned, go to our website, westonaprice.org. And that's it. Let's keep in touch, everybody. See you next time.
Thanks for listening today. We have all kinds of resources to support you on your health journey. On the Weston A. Price Foundation website, you'll find podcasts, blogs, articles, and brochures related to just about any health topic you can imagine. You can also find a local chapter to help you discover sources of real, organic food in your area. And you can become a member to support the Foundation's mission of education, research, and activism. Visit westonaprice.org for all this and more. And remember that the Wise Traditions podcast is available on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts. Wise Traditions is a project of the Weston A. Price Foundation for wise traditions in food, farming, and the healing arts. The content on this podcast is provided for informational purposes only and is not intended to substitute for the advice provided by your doctor or healthcare professional. It is not intended to be, nor does it constitute healthcare or medical advice.